Sarah thought she had built the perfect life with her college sweetheart, but when she came home early from her sister's wedding to find him in their bed with their 19-year-old babysitter, she had no idea that her quiet billionaire father had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to remind her husband exactly who owned his entire world. Sarah Martinez had always believed in the power of quiet contentment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At 32, she had everything she thought she wanted. A beautiful colonial house in Maple Heights, 2 adorable children, and a husband who still brought her flowers every Friday after 8 years of marriage. She worked part-time as a graphic designer from her home office, perfectly balancing motherhood with her creative passion. Life felt like a warm embrace, predictable and safe. The morning of her sister's wedding started like any other Saturday. 7-year-old Emma bounced into the bedroom at dawn, her wild curls matching Sarah's own, chattering excitedly about being the flower girl. 4-year-old Jake followed, clutching his stuffed elephant and demanding pancakes with extra syrup. Sarah smiled, pulling both children onto the bed where her husband David still lay sleeping. David worked as a regional manager for Meridian Industries, a massive corporate conglomerate that seemed to have its fingers in everything from real estate development to technology consulting. He had worked his way up from an entry-level position straight out of college, and Sarah was proud of how hard he had fought for every promotion. The company provided them with excellent benefits, a generous salary, and the kind of stability that allowed Sarah to work part-time and be present for their children. Their babysitter, Jessica, arrived at 10 that morning with her usual bright smile and boundless energy. At 19, she was studying early childhood education at the local community college and had been watching Emma and Jake for almost 2 years. The children adored her, and Sarah appreciated how responsible and mature Jessica seemed despite her young age. She had long auburn hair that she always wore in a neat ponytail, and a wholesome, girl-next-door beauty that reminded Sarah of herself at that age. David had already left for his Saturday golf game with his business partners, a monthly tradition that Sarah never minded. She enjoyed having some time to herself to prepare for special occasions, and today was particularly important. Her younger sister, Monica, was marrying her longtime boyfriend in an elegant ceremony at the Grand View Country Club, about an hour outside the city. Sarah spent extra time getting ready, choosing a flowing navy dress that complemented her olive complexion and styling her shoulder-length hair in soft waves. She wanted to look perfect for Monica's big day, especially since their parents would be there. Her father, Robert Santos, was flying in from his corporate headquarters in Chicago specifically for the wedding. Robert Santos was a man who commanded attention without ever raising his voice. At 58, he had built Santos Enterprises from a small construction company into a multinational corporation with interests spanning from commercial real estate to manufacturing. Sarah had inherited his dark eyes and sharp business instincts, though she had chosen a quieter path in life. Her father had always supported her decisions, even when he clearly hoped she might join the family business. The relationship between David and her father had always been cordial but distant. Robert was polite during family gatherings, asking appropriate questions about David's work and the children. But Sarah sensed an underlying tension she could never quite identify. David seemed nervous around her father, which Sarah attributed to the natural intimidation anyone might feel around such a successful businessman. Before leaving for the wedding, Sarah kissed both children goodbye and reminded Jessica about their bedtime routines. Emma and Jake were planning to have a movie marathon and build a fort in the living room, activities that would keep them happily occupied. Jessica assured her that everything would be fine, and Sarah felt that familiar pang of gratitude for finding such a trustworthy caregiver. The drive to the country club gave Sarah time to think about how blessed she felt. She and David had met during their sophomore year at State University, where he was studying business administration and she was pursuing her degree in graphic design. Their romance had been the kind of slow-burning, steady love that seemed to promise a lifetime of happiness. He proposed during their senior year with a modest ring that she treasured more than any expensive jewelry. Their early married years had been challenging financially, with David working long hours to establish himself at Meridian Industries while Sarah freelanced to help make ends meet. But they had weathered those difficulties together, supporting each other through late nights and tight budgets. When Emma was born, they felt like their little family was complete. Jake's arrival 2 years later had been an unexpected but wonderful surprise. Monica's wedding was everything Sarah had hoped it would be. The ceremony was beautiful, with white roses and fairy lights creating a magical atmosphere in the country club's garden pavilion. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she watched her baby sister exchange vows with Thomas, a kind-hearted accountant who clearly worshipped the ground Monica walked on. During the reception, Sarah found herself seated at the family table next to her father. Robert looked distinguished in his charcoal gray suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his presence commanding even in the relaxed wedding atmosphere. He had flown in on his private jet that morning and would be returning to Chicago the following day for important business meetings. Their conversation was pleasant but brief, touching on the children's activities, Sarah's recent design projects, and Monica's obvious happiness. Robert asked about David's work at Meridian Industries, with what seemed like casual interest, though Sarah noticed his expression grew thoughtful when she mentioned David's recent promotion to senior regional manager. The reception continued late into the evening, with dancing and champagne toasts that celebrated not just Monica and Thomas, but the joy of family coming together. Sarah felt relaxed and happy, surrounded by people she loved, and celebrating such a meaningful milestone. She danced with her father during the traditional father-daughter dance, spinning around the floor while he told her how proud he was of the woman she had become. As the evening wound down, Sarah realized she was more tired than she had expected. The emotional high of the wedding, combined with the champagne and rich food, left her feeling pleasantly exhausted. Monica and Thomas were staying at the country club's hotel for their wedding night before flying to Hawaii for their honeymoon, so there was no need for Sarah to help with any cleanup or post-wedding activities. She said her goodbyes around 10:30, hugging her parents and promising to call her father before he flew back to Chicago. The drive home was peaceful, with soft music playing on the radio and the satisfaction of a perfect day settling over her like a warm blanket. She found herself looking forward to crawling into bed next to David and sharing all the details of the wedding. The house was quiet when Sarah pulled into their driveway at 11:45. She noticed that David's car was in the garage, which meant he had returned from his golf outing and evening out with his friends. Jessica's small Honda was still parked on the street, which wasn't unusual since she sometimes stayed late on weekends if Sarah and David were both out for the evening. Sarah entered through the front door, expecting to find Jessica watching television in the living room while the children slept upstairs. Instead, the living room was empty, except for the remnants of the promised fort-building project. Blankets and pillows were scattered across the furniture, and she could see evidence of the movie marathon in the empty popcorn bowls and juice boxes left on the coffee table. She smiled, thinking about how much fun Emma and Jake must have had with their beloved babysitter. Jessica was always so creative with activities, and the children constantly begged for her to come over, even when Sarah didn't need childcare help. It warmed Sarah's heart to know that her children had such a positive female role model in their lives. Assuming that Jessica and David were probably in the kitchen settling up payment for the evening, Sarah kicked off her heels and padded quietly upstairs to check on the children. Emma's room was first, and Sarah peeked in to find her daughter sleeping peacefully, her dark hair spread across the pillow, and her favorite stuffed unicorn clutched tightly in her arms. Jake's room was next, and he was sprawled across his toddler bed in the boneless way that only small children can manage, his elephant tucked under one arm. The sight of her sleeping children filled Sarah with the deep contentment that motherhood had brought to her life. These quiet moments, when she could simply watch them dream and feel overwhelmed by love, were among her most treasured experiences. She adjusted Jake's blanket and closed Emma's door more securely, then headed toward the master bedroom to change out of her wedding attire. The master bedroom was at the end of the hallway, with a large window overlooking their backyard garden. Sarah had decorated it in soothing blues and whites, creating a peaceful retreat that felt like a sanctuary from the outside world. She was already mentally preparing for the luxury of a hot bath and comfortable pajamas when she noticed that the bedroom door was slightly ajar and soft light was spilling into the hallway. She pushed the door open quietly, not wanting to wake David if he had already gone to sleep, and stepped into a nightmare that would shatter her perfect world into a million irreparable pieces. David was in their bed, but he wasn't alone. Jessica was with him, her auburn hair spread across Sarah's pillow, both of them lost in an intimate embrace that left no room for misinterpretation. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't notice Sarah standing frozen in the doorway, her hand still on the door handle, and her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her legs weak. This was her bed, her husband, her home, her life being violated in the most fundamental way possible. The young woman she had trusted with her children, welcomed into her family, and treated almost like a daughter, was destroying everything Sarah held sacred. For several seconds that felt like hours, Sarah simply stood there in shock. Part of her hoped she was having some kind of terrible dream, that the emotional exhaustion from the wedding had somehow created this horrific hallucination. But the sounds, the sights, the terrible reality of what was happening in front of her eyes couldn't be denied or explained away. David must have sensed her presence because he suddenly looked up, his face changing from passion to shock to something that looked almost like relief. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica followed his gaze and let out a small scream, grabbing for the sheets to cover herself while David scrambled to sit up and find his voice. "Sarah," he said, and there was no surprise in his tone, no shame, just a kind of weary acknowledgement that suggested this moment had been inevitable. "I didn't expect you back so early." The casual nature of his response, as if she had simply walked in on him reading a book rather than betraying their marriage vows, was almost more shocking than the infidelity itself. There was no panic, no desperate attempt to explain or apologize, just the tired demeanor of a man who had been caught doing something he had been doing for quite some time. Jessica was crying now, clutching the sheets and looking between Sarah and David with the kind of terror that only comes with being caught in an unforgivable act. Her youth was suddenly starkly apparent, and Sarah realized with sick clarity that this girl was barely older than some of Sarah's college interns. The power dynamic, the betrayal of trust, the violation of their home and family made the situation even more devastating. "How long?" Sarah asked, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. She was amazed that she could speak at all, that her vocal cords were functioning when everything else inside her seemed to have shut down. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she had seen him make thousands of times when he was stressed about work or worried about money. Seeing that familiar movement in this context felt like another violation, as if he was contaminating even her most basic memories of their life together. "6 months," he said quietly, and Jessica made a small sound that might have been a sob. "Sarah, I wanted to tell you. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. 6 months. Half a year of lies. Of Jessica coming into their home and playing with their children while carrying on this secret relationship. Half a year of Sarah trusting both of them completely. Of feeling grateful for Jessica's help and proud of David's dedication to their family. The scope of the deception was overwhelming. In our bed," Sarah said, and now her voice was starting to crack, "with our children sleeping down the hall." The mention of Emma and Jake seemed to snap David out of his strange calm. For the first time, he looked truly ashamed, his eyes dropping to the twisted sheets that told the story of how thoroughly he had violated their marriage. Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I know how wrong this is. I know I've ruined everything." Sarah looked at this young woman, who had been like family to them, who had been trusted with the most precious parts of Sarah's life. Jessica's tears seemed genuine, but they couldn't undo the months of deception, the careful planning that must have gone into these encounters, the countless times she had looked Sarah in the eye while carrying on this affair. "Get out," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "Both of you, get out of my house." David started to protest, saying something about needing to talk, about explanations and working things out, but Sarah wasn't listening anymore. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a rage so pure and focused that it frightened her. She had never felt anything like this before, this combination of betrayal and fury and heartbreak that seemed to be consuming her from the inside out. Jessica gathered her clothes quickly, still crying and trying to apologize, but Sarah couldn't bear to look at her anymore. This girl who had seemed so sweet, so trustworthy, so genuinely caring toward Emma and Jake had been living a lie for months. Every smile, every conversation, every moment of apparent friendship had been contaminated by this secret. David was getting dressed now too, moving slowly as if he hoped Sarah might change her mind about making him leave. He kept trying to start conversations, to explain or justify or somehow make this situation less catastrophic than it was. But Sarah was done listening. She was done believing anything that came out of his mouth. "The children cannot see you like this," she said, her voice cold and controlled. "They cannot know about this tonight. You will leave quietly, and you will figure out what you're going to tell them later, but they are not going to be traumatized by this scene." Her protectiveness toward Emma and Jake was automatic, overriding even her own pain. They were innocent in all of this, and she would not let David's selfishness destroy their sense of security, along with everything else. As David and Jessica prepared to leave, Sarah found herself thinking about practical things. She would need to change the sheets, obviously. She would need to find a new babysitter. She would need to figure out how to explain to the children why Jessica wouldn't be coming around anymore. She would need to call a lawyer. The mundane details of dismantling a life felt surreal in the aftermath of such profound betrayal. How do you go from planning to share wedding stories with your husband to planning a divorce in the space of minutes? How do you explain to 7-year-old Emma why Daddy won't be living with them anymore? After David and Jessica left, the house felt different. The familiar spaces that had been her sanctuary now felt contaminated, filled with questions about what else had happened here, what other lies had been told within these walls she had considered safe. She found herself wondering if this was the first time they had used the master bedroom, or if her bed had been the scene of previous betrayals. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed where she had just discovered her husband's infidelity, still wearing her navy dress from Monica's wedding. The contrast between the joy of the evening and the devastation of coming home was almost too much to process. Just hours ago, she had been dancing with her father, celebrating love and commitment, feeling grateful for her blessed life. Now she was alone in a house that no longer felt like home, facing the reality that her marriage had been a lie for months. The man she had loved and trusted completely had been deceiving her with someone she had welcomed into their family. The life she had built so carefully was crumbling around her, and she had no idea how to begin picking up the pieces. She thought about her father, probably back at his hotel room near the country club, preparing for his flight back to Chicago in the morning. Robert Santos was a man who solved problems, who built empires and commanded respect, but even he couldn't fix this. Even his wealth and power couldn't undo the betrayal that had just destroyed his daughter's world. Or could it? As Sarah sat in the ruins of her perfect life, she began to remember things about her father's business empire that she had never paid much attention to before. Meridian Industries, David's employer, had seemed familiar when he first got the job, but she had never made the connection. Now, in her devastation and rage, pieces of information began clicking together in ways that would have terrified David if he had known what his wife was realizing. Sarah Martinez was not just a betrayed wife and devoted mother. She was the daughter of Robert Santos, and David had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Sarah spent the weekend in a haze of grief and planning. She called her father Sunday morning, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Robert listened without interruption as she explained what had happened, his silence growing more ominous with each detail. "I need to know something, Dad," Sarah said finally. "Meridian Industries. David's company. Do you have any connection to them?" The pause that followed told her everything. "Sarah, sweetheart, I own 60% of Meridian Industries. I have for 3 years." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Her father had been quietly watching David's career, monitoring the man who had married his daughter. Every promotion, every raise, every opportunity David had received had been orchestrated by the grandfather of the children he had just betrayed. "He doesn't know, does he?" Sarah asked. "No, and neither did you. I wanted your marriage to succeed on its own merits." Robert's voice carried a cold edge she had rarely heard. "That consideration no longer applies." Monday morning arrived like a reckoning. David had spent the weekend at his brother's house, sending desperate text messages that Sarah ignored. He returned to work at Meridian Industries, probably hoping the familiar routine would provide some normalcy while he figured out how to salvage his marriage. The first sign that his world was crumbling came at 9:15 a.m. David's direct supervisor, Mr. Harrison, appeared at his office door with a grim expression and a thick manila folder. "David, we need to talk. HR wants to see you immediately." In the sterile conference room, David faced a panel of executives he barely knew. The allegations were damning and thoroughly documented. Misappropriation of company funds. fraudulent expense reports dating back 18 months, unauthorized use of company resources for personal benefit. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously assembled. "These are fabricated," David stammered. But even as he said it, he recognized documents with his own signature, transactions he had approved, decisions that now looked criminally negligent when viewed through this lens. "Security will escort you out," Harrison said coldly. "Your company property, including your vehicle, needs to be returned immediately. Legal action will follow." By noon, David's professional reputation was in ruins. Word spread quickly through their social circle. The man who had seemed so successful, so stable, was suddenly unemployed and facing potential criminal charges. His golf buddies stopped returning calls. Professional contacts became mysteriously unavailable. But Robert Santos was just getting started. The private investigation firm he had hired within hours of Sarah's call was thorough and discreet. By Tuesday, they had uncovered a pattern of behavior that painted David as a serial cheater. Jessica wasn't his first affair. There had been others. A colleague from his previous job. A client's assistant. A woman from his gym. Each relationship carefully hidden, each betrayal a knife in Sarah's back she had never felt. The evidence arrived at Sarah's house in a sealed envelope. Photos, text messages, receipts from hotels and restaurants. A timeline of deception that stretched back almost their entire marriage. David hadn't just betrayed her. He had built a double life so complete that Sarah wondered if she had ever known him at all. Meanwhile, Jessica's world was collapsing in parallel. The community college where she studied received an anonymous tip about her inappropriate relationship with a client family. Her scholarship was revoked. Her campus job disappeared. Her reputation in their small community, where everyone knew everyone, was destroyed overnight. The young woman who had seemed so bright and promising found herself ostracized and alone. Her parents, conservative people who had been so proud of their daughter's achievements, could barely look at her. The family she had torn apart had been well liked in the community, and Jessica became the target of whispered conversations and cold shoulders wherever she went. David tried to contact Sarah repeatedly, but she had changed the locks and refused to see him. His attempts to visit the children were blocked by a restraining order that appeared with surprising speed through the court system. His lawyer, one of the best in the city, suddenly found conflicts of interest that prevented him from continuing the representation. By Thursday, David was staying in a cheap motel, his credit cards mysteriously declined, his bank accounts frozen pending investigation of the criminal charges. The comfortable life he had built was evaporating with terrifying efficiency. He finally understood what was happening when his brother Tom called him Friday evening. "Dave, what did you do?" "My company just lost the biggest contract we've ever had." The client specifically mentioned your situation as a factor in their decision. This is connected to Sarah's family, isn't it? The revelation hit David like a sledgehammer. Robert Santos hadn't just been his father-in-law. He had been his ultimate employer, the puppet master pulling strings David had never seen. Every success in his career had been a gift from the man whose daughter he had betrayed. Saturday morning brought the final blow. David received a call from the district attorney's office. The investigation into his alleged financial crimes had been fast-tracked. A grand jury would be convened within the week. His passport had been flagged. Travel restrictions were in place. As David sat in his dingy motel room, surrounded by the wreckage of his life, he began to understand the true scope of Robert Santos's power. This wasn't just about losing a job or facing legal troubles. This was about being systematically erased from the world he had inhabited. Every door that had once been open to him was now closed. Every opportunity that had once seemed available was now impossible. Every relationship that had once provided support was now poisoned by association with his downfall. But Sarah was discovering her own strength. With David gone and the initial shock wearing off, she found herself thinking more clearly than she had in years. Her father's support was unwavering, but he was careful not to overshadow her own decisions. "What do you want to happen next?" Robert asked during one of their daily phone calls. "I want him to understand what he threw away," Sarah said quietly. "I want him to know that the life he destroyed was worth more than whatever he thought he was getting with Jessica." The divorce proceedings moved with unusual speed. David's lawyer, the third one he had managed to hire, advised him to accept whatever terms Sarah offered. Fighting would only make things worse, and things were already catastrophic. Sarah kept the house, received full custody of the children, and was awarded alimony that would ensure Emma and Jake never suffered financially from their father's choices. David would be allowed supervised visits once he completed court-mandated counseling and therapy. The criminal charges resulted in a plea bargain that kept David out of prison but left him with a felony record that would follow him forever. He was ordered to pay restitution and perform community service. His professional licenses were revoked. Jessica, meanwhile, had left town entirely. Her dreams of becoming a teacher were over. The scandal had made her unemployable in her chosen field. She disappeared one night, leaving only a forwarding address with the post office and a note of apology that would never be enough. 6 months after that devastating night, Sarah stood in her garden watching Emma and Jake play. The children had adjusted better than she had dared hope. They missed their father, but they were resilient, and Sarah had worked hard to ensure their world remained stable and loving. Her father visited more often now, building relationships with his grandchildren that had been superficial before. Emma adored his stories about building his business empire, while Jake was fascinated by the helicopters and planes that were part of Robert's corporate world. "Mommy," Emma asked one afternoon, "why doesn't Daddy live with us anymore?" Sarah had prepared for this question, working with a child psychologist to find age-appropriate ways to explain the situation. "Sometimes adults make choices that hurt their families," she said gently. "Daddy made some choices that meant he couldn't live here anymore, but he still loves you and Jake very much, and that will never change." It was enough for now. Later, when they were older, there would be more complicated conversations, but for now, it was enough that they felt safe and loved. David occasionally sent letters through his lawyer, begging for forgiveness and a chance to rebuild their family. Sarah read them once and filed them away. The man who had written those letters was a stranger to her now. The David she had loved had been a carefully constructed lie. Robert never spoke directly about what he had done to orchestrate David's downfall. There was no need. Sarah understood that her father's love for her and his grandchildren had motivated actions that would have terrified most people, but she also understood that David had brought this destruction on himself through his choices. The quiet billionaire who had built an empire through careful planning and strategic thinking had simply applied those same skills to protecting his family. David had betrayed the wrong man's daughter, and the consequences had been swift and absolute. On a sunny afternoon exactly 1 year after Monica's wedding, Sarah received a call from her sister. "I saw the news about David," Monica said quietly. "Are you okay?" Sarah looked out her window at Emma and Jake building a fort in the backyard, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, naive and trusting, living in a fairy tale that had been built on lies. "I'm better than okay," she said, and realized it was true. "I'm free." The simple wife who had discovered her husband's betrayal had learned that sometimes the most devastating losses lead to the most profound liberation. And sometimes, having a billionaire father who loves you means never having to face the consequences of other people's cruelty alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.